On the 10th of May, 1943, in the brown hills above Tunis, a 21-year-old German sergeant raised his hands over his head and waited to be shot. His name was George Fusel. Before the war, he had been an art student from Landshut in Bavaria, and he had carried a sketchbook across North Africa, filling it not with tanks or trenches, but with the faces of the people he passed. Now the sketchbook was buried in his pack. The desert around him was filling with surrendering men, and everything he had been told for 4 years pointed to one ending. He had been told the Americans shot their prisoners. He had been told that the ones they didn't shoot, they starved. German radio had been very clear about what happened to a Wehrmacht soldier who fell into Allied hands. And all around Faust, 250,000 men of Rommel's Afrika Korps, the best soldiers Germany had, were about to find out whether it was true. It was not true. What happened to him instead over the days and weeks that followed made no sense to him at all. He was not shot. He was fed more than he had eaten in months. He was moved through a system so vast, so calm, so utterly unhurried that it unsettled him more than any cruelty could have. And then he was put on a ship and carried west across the Atlantic toward a country he had been taught was soft, divided, and one hard push from collapse. Hold on to that word, collapse. Because what George Fuss and hundreds of thousands of men like him were about to see would turn it inside out. And when they sat down to describe it in letters to the people they loved most in the world, something happened that not one of them saw coming. Their families did not believe them. Not were surprised, not found it hard to picture. Did not believe them. Read the words their own sons and husbands had written in their own hands and decided the letters were lies. That is the mystery we are going to take apart today. What was actually inside those letters? Why the people back home refused to accept a single line of them? And what that refusal, quiet as it was, tells us about a war that was by then already being decided. If the American side of this war is why you're here, the parts most documentaries skip right past, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It's the one thing that helps stories like this find the right people. To understand how a letter could be unbelievable, you first have to stand in the two worlds at either end of it. Start with the scale because the numbers are hard to hold in your head. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States took in close to 400,000 German prisoners of war, not in some sealed-off corner of the country. In more than 400 camps scattered across 46 of the 48 states, German soldiers picked cotton in Georgia. They stacked hay in Nebraska, cut timber in Michigan, pulled sugar beets out of the ground in Colorado. If you lived in rural America in those years, there is a real chance the men working the next field overwore the uniform of the Afrika Korps. That alone is a fact most people have never heard. But it isn't the strange part. The strange part is how those men were treated. And I want you to hold on to this because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. The American government had made a decision about these prisoners. A cold, deliberate, deeply unpopular decision, and it had almost nothing to do with kindness. Across the country, ordinary Americans were furious about it. Their sons were dying in Italy and in the Pacific. They themselves were living on ration books, ration meat, ration sugar, ration gasoline. And meanwhile, the enemy, a few miles down the road behind barbed wire, was sitting down to 3 full meals a day. People wrote to Washington by the hundreds every single week. Some of them demanded the prisoners simply be put against a wall and shot. And they gave the camps a nickname that carried all of it in 2 words, the Fritz Ritz. As in the Ritz Hotel, as in, we are pampering the men who killed our boys. So, picture the collision this whole story is built on. On one side of the ocean, a German soldier in an American camp, eating better than he had in years, watching a country he'd been promised was falling apart. On the other side, his family inside a Germany that was being bombed into rubble, where food was vanishing from the shelves, where the radio still swore that America was weak and that German prisoners were being worked to death. And running between them, a single sheet of paper passed through 2 sets of sensors carrying nothing but a plain description of ordinary daily life in America. Now you can see the trap. The Sun writes the truth. And the truth sounds exactly like the enemy propaganda his family has been warned about. Exactly the kind of thing the Americans would force a captured man to write. So his mother reads it and thinks they made him say this. Or she thinks something worse, that the man who wrote it isn't really her son at all. We're going to follow these letters the whole way down from the moment of capture into the camps, through the kitchens and the farm fields and the classrooms, all the way to the day the shooting stopped. And these men finally went home to see with their own eyes what their families had lived through. And by the end, that one small act of disbelief is going to grow into something far larger than a family misreading a letter. It is going to become the sharpest measure we have of why this war ended the way it did. But the camps and the fury all come later. Because for George Fussell and the men of the Afrika Korps, the first thing that cracked their picture of the enemy didn't happen in a camp. It didn't happen on American soil at all. It happened out on the open Atlantic on the very ships their own U-boat were hunting. And it began with something an American put into their hands without saying a single word. That is where the unraveling of the hardest soldiers Germany had really started. The ship was the last place any of them expected to be fed. For the men of the Afrika Korps, the Atlantic crossing began in the early summer of 1943. They were marched up the gangplanks of American Liberty ships, the same mass-produced cargo vessels that hauled war material east, and packed into the holds for the long voyage west. And here's the first thing that did not fit. Every man aboard knew these waters belonged to the U-boat. Germany's own submarines were out there in the dark sinking Allied shipping at a staggering rate, and a submarine commander could not tell a prison transport from any other hull. The German prisoners were being carried across an ocean their own navy was doing its level best to turn into a graveyard. So they braced for the worst. What they got instead was breakfast, and then lunch, and then dinner. Real food in quantities that stopped men cold. White bread, meat, coffee, sugar, more than many of them had seen on a plate in a year of desert fighting. Remember what these soldiers had come from at the end in Tunisia? They had been scraping by on whatever little could slip past Allied aircraft. Now they were enemy prisoners on a ship that might be torpedoed at any moment, being handed more food than their own army had managed to give them. And it was not a one-time thing, and it was not a trick. The same scene was still playing out more than a year later. After D-Day, a young German soldier named Werner Goltz was captured in Normandy, marched to the coast, and put aboard an Allied transport. He and his fellow prisoners were handed a meal: sausage, mashed potatoes, white bread, and a cup of coffee. They ate it, and then, still hungry, still not quite believing it, they got back in line and ate again, and got back in line a third time until the mess officer finally lost his patience and shouted a line that tells you more about this whole story than any document ever could. There were only 800 German prisoners aboard, he yelled, and 8,000 meals had already been served. Sit with that picture for a moment. Men who had been the enemy only hours before, eating a victorious nation out of its own ship's galley, going back again and again because some part of them simply could not accept that the food would keep coming. That hunger, that disbelief in the line for a third plate, that is the entire war in miniature. One side had so much it could feed its prisoners until they were ashamed to ask for more. The other side could no longer feed its own. But the food, as strange as it was, turned out to be the smaller shock. The bigger one was waiting at the dock. The transports landed at ports like Norfolk and Newport News in Virginia, and the prisoners were unloaded and loaded onto trains for the long ride inland to the camps. And not cattle cars, passenger trains, comfortable ones, Pullman coaches with upholstered seats and proper windows, the kind a paying American traveler would ride. Decades later, survivors still describe that detail with something close to bewilderment, that the United States had put its captured enemies into comfortable rail cars and sent them rolling in broad daylight straight through the middle of the country. And it was the middle of the country that did the real damage to what they believed. Because here is what George Fussell and tens of thousands of men like him saw through those windows. Mile after mile after mile of a nation the war had never once touched. No bombed-out cities, no rubble in the streets, no craters torn through the fields. Towns with their lights burning at night openly because there was nothing in the sky to hide from. Farms with tractors sitting idle in the yards. Factories running at full tilt pouring smoke into the air with no enemy aircraft anywhere above them. The country rolled on and on and on, larger than anything in their experience and completely eerily intact. Now hold that against what these men had been told. America was soft. America was divided. America was one hard push from folding. They had been promised a hollow, exhausted enemy. And here it was, unscrolling past the train window for days on end, calm, vast, untouched, and so deep in resources that it could afford to run passenger trains for prisoners of war, while the rest of the world was on fire. And somewhere in those long days on the rails, a thought must have begun to take shape in the back of George Fuss's mind. The same thought forming in thousands of other minds rolling west across America. Soon he would be allowed to write home. Soon he would have to find words for all of this. The food, the trains, the endless unbroken land, and put those words on paper for a family living under the bombs in a country being slowly ground into powder. How do you tell the people you love that the enemy is winning not because he is cruel, but because he has so much he can afford to be generous? And how could anyone reading that by candlelight in a gutted German city ever believe a single line of it? But before we open those letters, there is a question we have been circling this whole time. And it's time to set it plainly on the table. None of this was an accident. Not the meals on the ship, not the Pullman cars, not the 3 full plates a day waiting in the camps. The United States was treating these prisoners this way on purpose, by policy, from the top down. There was a reason. And when you find out what that reason actually was, it is going to change the way you see every full plate and every small kindness in the rest of this story. Because it was decided far from any camp in Washington in cold blood by men who were not thinking about mercy at all. They were thinking about a single number. The number of American sons who were at that very moment in German hands. Go back with me for a moment, all the way to the beginning to 1942, before a single Afrika Korps prisoner had set foot on American soil. The United States at that point had almost no idea how to hold prisoners of war. In the entire First World War, it had kept only a few thousand in a handful of camps, and then mostly forgotten the whole business. Now, Great Britain came to Washington with a problem. Britain was running out of room. It had captured more Germans than its bombed and crowded island could possibly house, and it asked the Americans to take a share. To start, 175,000 men. The United States did not want them. It worried about escapes, about sabotage, about turning loose native German speakers inside a country at war. But there was nowhere else for them to go. And so reluctantly, America said yes, which meant America now had to answer a question it had never seriously faced. How do you treat the enemy once he is unarmed and in your hands? The answer came down from the War Department and the Office of the Provost Marshal General, the branch responsible for the prisoners, and it was absolute. The United States would follow the Geneva Convention of 1929 to the letter, every letter. Both Germany and America had signed that convention back in 1929, and its terms were demanding. A captured soldier had to be housed as well as the capturing nation housed its own troops, fed on the same scale. And this is the part that would enrage so many Americans, paid for any labor he did. 3 full meals, decent barracks, wages, by the book with no exceptions. And here is the thing I need you to understand, because it is the cold center of this entire story. That decision was not made out of kindness. It was made out of arithmetic. At the moment America was deciding how to feed German prisoners, there were tens of thousands of American boys sitting in German prison camps on the other side of the ocean. And that number was only going to grow. Every airman shot down over the Reich, every soldier captured in Italy or later in the Ardennes was a hostage to how Germany chose to behave. And the men in Washington understood something simple and ruthless about it. The way America treated its German prisoners would set the price Germany could be held to for American ones. Give the enemy even the smallest excuse. 1 starved prisoner, 1 beating, 1 violation he could point to, and that excuse would come back to land on an American son in a camp near Munich. So you gave him no excuse. None. You treated his men so correctly that he could never justify mistreating yours. That was the bet. Feed the enemy to keep your own boys alive. But try explaining that to the people back home. Across America, the policy landed like an insult. Mothers and fathers were burying sons. Families were clipping ration coupons for meat and sugar and gasoline, going without, doing their part, and reading in the paper that the enemy, a few counties over, was eating better than they were. The letters poured into Washington hundreds upon hundreds every week. Some were furious, some were heartbroken, and some stated it flatly. Stop coddling them. Line them up and shoot them. The mockery hardened into that nickname we keep coming back to, the Fritz Ritz. The idea that America had checked its enemies into a hotel, and the pressure climbed all the way to Congress. Picture the scene. Brigadier General Blackshear Bryan, an assistant provost marshal general, hauled before the House Committee on Military Affairs to answer the charge that the Army was pampering Nazis. He did not apologize, and he did not appeal to anyone's better nature. He laid out the arithmetic. He told the congressman that interrogations of captured Germans showed the overwhelming majority of them had surrendered, fully expecting to be treated well. And then he gave them the number that proved the bet was already paying off. Of the German soldiers captured in the weeks just after D-Day, he testified 88% had already accepted that the Americans would treat them according to the rules. And they believed it despite everything their own government had screamed at them to the contrary. Think about what that figure actually means, because it is easy to skim past. It means that out on the battlefields of France in the worst hours of the war, German soldiers were laying down their weapons more readily, surrendering instead of fighting to the death, because they had come to trust that the Americans would not murder them. General Eisenhower had safe conduct passes printed up, promising decent treatment, and scattered them by the millions behind German lines. And the German soldiers picked them up. They carried them in their pockets into captivity. Every man who surrendered on the strength of that promise was an enemy who stopped shooting at Americans. Which means the reputation built in those camps in Texas and Nebraska was in a very real and bloody sense saving American lives at the front. So now you have it. The full plates were policy. The Pullman cars were policy. The whole strange, generous machine these prisoners were riding through was the product of a calculation made in cold blood, held in place against the fury of a grieving nation, because the men in charge had decided that mercy toward the enemy was the surest way to bring their own sons home. And that is what makes the letter so impossible to untangle. Because when George Fistel finally sat down to write home, he wasn't describing a lucky break or a soft commenette. He was describing the working surface of a deliberate American strategy. The trouble was his family had no way of knowing any of that. To them, it would read like exactly what their government had warned them about. Words a captured man was forced to write. But here's what I want you to sit with as we go inside the camps and finally open one of these letters. The most unbelievable thing in them was not the food. It was not the wages or the radios or the picture shows. The single hardest detail for a German family to swallow had nothing to do with comfort at all. It was a name, a German name, and it was painted on an American mailbox at the end of a long American drive in front of a farmhouse bigger than anything its owners could have dreamed of owning back in the old country. In the late summer of 1943, a truck pulled up to a farm outside York, Nebraska, and 10 or 11 men in fatigues climbed down to stack hay. They were German soldiers. A boy named Kelly Holtis watched them work the fields across the road from his family's land that year, stacking hay, thinning sugar beets, doing the chores that the war had stripped of able-bodied American men. The labor shortage was that bad. Across rural America, with the young men gone overseas, the crops were rotting in the fields and the prisoners were the answer. The Geneva Convention allowed it as long as the work had nothing to do with the war and the men were paid. And so they were about 80 cents a day in camp script they could spend at the canteen. Germans picked cotton in the South. They pulled beets in Colorado, packed fruit in California canneries, cut timber in Michigan, and it was out on those farms, away from the barbed wire, that the deepest crack of all opened up in what these men believed. Because look at whose land they were working. In the German communities of the Midwest and the Great Plains, the prisoners were very often handed over to farmers with names like Hoffman and Schultz and Mueller. German names, sometimes the prisoner's own name. These were the families who had left Germany a generation or two before. And the prisoner had been taught exactly what to think of people like that. Nazi propaganda had a tidy story about the Germans who immigrated to America. They were the failures, the weak ones, the ones who couldn't make it in the fatherland, who turned their backs on their blood and ran off to a mongrel country to be nobody. Now, hold that story up against what the prisoner was actually standing in front of. The man who owned this farm, this supposed failure, this traitor to his blood, owned more land than a German aristocrat. There was a tractor in his yard, and often more than one. When a tractor was still a rare thing on a German farm. And when the prisoner was brought up to the house, there was electric light in every single room, a refrigerator humming in the kitchen, a telephone on the wall, a radio. The man Berlin had written off as a loser was living better than the landed gentry back home, and he had done it in 2 generations on soil the prisoner had been told was barren and soulless. I want you to feel the size of that, because the food on the ship was a shock to the body, but this was a shock to the worldview. Everything cracked at once. The country wasn't weak. The immigrants weren't failures. The propaganda wasn't shading the truth. It had the truth backwards. And so we come at last to the letters themselves. What does a man write home when this is what he's seeing? He writes the truth plainly. He describes the food, the work and the wages, the farmhouse, and the lights and the machines. And then, and this is the detail that more than any other made families back home put the letter down in disbelief. He tells them to stop sending packages. Sit with that. In a normal war, the lifeline runs one direction. The family at home scrapes together what little it can and ships it to the soldier in his hard place. But here the prisoners were writing back to say, please don't. Don't send food. Don't send coffee. Don't go without on my account. I have more here behind enemy barbed wire than you have in your own kitchen. The things that had vanished from German shells were stacked in the camp canteen. The prisoner was in the most literal way richer as a captive of the enemy than his own family was as free citizens of the Reich. Now put yourself on the receiving end of that letter. You are a mother in a German city that the bombers visit at night. Your bread is rationed. Your coffee is roasted acorns. And a letter arrives in your son's handwriting telling you he is eating meat and white bread, that he has paid for his work, that the enemy has put a radio in the barracks, and begging you not to send him anything because he has plenty. What do you conclude? You conclude that it cannot be real, that the Americans dictated it, that they forced him or faked it or broke him. Because the alternative that every word is true is a thing too large and too frightening to let into your head. It would mean the war was already lost. That is the engine of the disbelief. The letters were unbelievable not because they were extreme, but because they were accurate in a world built on a lie. And here is what's strange and quietly moving about it. On the American end, the relationships these letters described were often exactly as warm as they sounded. A man named Hans Vea, who had grown up in what he called a cold water flat in Germany, said simply of his time as a prisoner that the treatment was excellent and the food was excellent. In Nebraska, a family named Lookin struck up such an easy friendship with their prisoner farm hands that they kept writing to them for years after the war, sent them food and clothing when Germany was starving, and eventually traveled across the ocean to visit them. On a farm in South Carolina, a family invited their German workers to Christmas dinner. And by the end of the night, the enemy soldiers were gathered around the family piano singing carols while the Americans sang along. Town by town, the language in the local papers shifted over 2 years from the Nazis to the German soldiers to finally the German boys, none of which a frightened family in a bombed-out city could possibly believe. But while these prisoners were filling their letters with the food and the farms and the strange kindness of the enemy, the Americans running the camps were quietly doing something else to them. Something most of the prisoners never noticed was even happening. It was deliberate. It was secret. And it would grow into one of the most ambitious experiments of the entire war. An attempt to reach inside the minds of 500,000 enemy soldiers and change what they believed. And the most powerful weapon in it turned out to be the very letters they were writing home. In March of 1945, a newspaper began circulating through the German prison camps of America. It was called Du, The Call. It was printed in German, and at a glance, it looked like something the prisoners had made for themselves. It was not. It was made for them by the United States Army. Duff was the visible tip of a secret program. The Army had quietly set up a special unit staffed in part by university professors with a single audacious goal to reach inside the minds of nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers and loosen 12 years of Nazi conditioning. They printed that newspaper. They stocked the camp libraries with books that were burned or banned back in Germany. And eventually they ran classes in democracy, in civics, in how a free country governs itself. And they did all of it in secret for reasons that tell you how delicate the whole thing was. Openly trying to re-educate prisoners almost certainly violated the Geneva Convention's ban on feeding them propaganda. The same convention America was bending over backwards to honor. Worse, if Berlin found out, it might retaliate against American prisoners. So, the most ambitious thought reform experiment of the war had to be run as if it weren't happening at all. And inside the army itself, plenty of officers thought it was foolish. You cannot reach into a grown man's head, they argued, and rewire what he believes. And even if you could, even if you turned a hardened Nazi into something else, who was to say he'd come out a Democrat, he might just as easily come out a communist. The doubters had a point because the program ran straight into a wall the Americans had badly underestimated. The wall was this. The Nazis had come to America, too. Here is something most people never picture when they imagine these camps. The barbed wire didn't separate Germans from Nazis. It pinned them in together. And inside several camps, the hardcore National Socialists, often the toughest combat veterans, seized control of the prisoner community and ran it by fear, exactly as they had at home. They held secret courts. They decided who was loyal and who was a traitor. A prisoner who took the democracy classes too eagerly, who grew too friendly with the American guards, who said the wrong thing about Hitler, that man could be beaten in the night. In the worst cases, he was killed. The United States eventually had to pull the fanatics out and concentrate them in a separate camp at Alva, Oklahoma, just to protect everyone else. And after the war, it tried a number of German prisoners for murdering their own comrades on American soil and hanged several of them at Fort Leavenworth. So picture the bind a prisoner was actually in. He could see the truth all around him. The food, the farms, the lights, the open friendliness of his captors. But to say so out loud in the wrong barracks was dangerous. To believe it too openly was dangerous. And that is what makes the next turn in this story so quietly astonishing, because the most effective re-education in America had nothing to do with Duo or the professors or the classes the doubters fought over. It was already happening on its own, and no Nazi enforcer in any camp could stop it. It was happening in the mail. Stop and follow the logic with me, because this is the heart of it. Every time a prisoner sat down and honestly described his day, the meal, the wage, the farmhouse with electric light in every room, he was composing a piece of testimony. Not propaganda written by an American and stamped with a fake signature, but the plain truth in a German soldier's own hand addressed to the people the Reich most needed to keep believing in the war. The Homerat, the mothers, the wives, the children. America could never have mailed a more devastating message into the heart of Germany than the one its prisoners were writing for free. The enemy had become, without meaning to America's most credible witness. And there was only one thing standing between that message and its full effect. One defense the Reich had left against the truth its own soldiers were posting home. Disbelief. Do you see the strange shape of it now? The family's refusal to believe the letters, the very thing the title of this whole story turns on, was in its way the last shield protecting the German war effort from collapse of morale. As long as a mother could tell herself the letter was a forgery, a lie, a thing the Americans forced her son to write, she could keep her faith in the fatherland intact. The moment she believed him, the war was over in her heart. So she chose not to believe, not out of foolishness, out of survival. The disbelief was a wall she built to keep standing. The Americans, for their part, could measure that their experiment was working, even if they couldn't always see how. When the war ended, the army pulled more than 22,000 departing prisoners, and roughly 3 out of 4 said they were leaving the United States with a real appreciation for democracy and a friendly feeling toward the people who had held them. 25,000 of the most promising were rushed through accelerated classes and sent straight home ahead of the others to seed the new Germany. But a poll is just a poll. The professors could argue all day about whether a classroom could change a man. The deeper question, the one this entire gamble was really staked on, was never about attitudes on a survey form. It was about lives, American lives. The men in Washington had bet that treating the enemy well would keep American sons alive in German camps. They had paid for that bet in public fury, in full plates. In 3 years of being called coddlers of Nazis. So when the shooting finally stopped, there came a reckoning, a way to know at last whether any of it had been worth the cost. And it came down to 2 numbers set side by side. One number for the American boys who fell into German hands. One for the American boys who fell into the hands of an enemy that played by no rules at all. When you put those 2 figures next to each other, you get one of the starkest verdicts the entire war ever handed down. And it tells you exactly what all those full plates actually bought. Here are the 2 numbers. I want you to hear them slowly because everything in this story has been building toward them. Of the American soldiers who fell into German hands during the war, about 4 out of every 100 died in captivity. For percent of the American soldiers who fell into Japanese hands, more than 28 out of every 100 died. 28%. And it goes further than dying. Among the men who survived the Japanese camps, around 90% came home so broken that they had to be hospitalized before they could even rejoin their families. Among the survivors of the German camps, that figure was about 10%. Sit with the gap between 4 and 28. That is not a statistic. That is tens of thousands of American sons who walked back through their own front doors specifically because of the side of the war they were captured on. And the men in Washington who chose to feed German prisoners steak while their own countrymen lived on ration books. The men called coddlers. The men buried under sacks of hate mail. They had bet on exactly this. The bet paid out in the only currency that ever mattered. American boys alive. Now, why did it work? Not because Germany was kind. Germany was running death camps. Let there be no confusion about that. But toward the Western Allied prisoners, specifically the Americans, the British, the Canadians, Germany largely kept to the Geneva Convention. An American assessment late in the war put it bluntly. Measured against the precise terms of the convention, Germany's treatment of American prisoners could most accurately be called fair, not generous, not warm, fair. And fair was the difference between 4% and 28%. The deterrent the camps in Texas and Nebraska had built, the simple fact that Germany had 400,000 of its own men in American hands eating well, being treated correctly. That deterrent reached all the way across the ocean and held a roof over the heads of American prisoners in Bavaria. Let me make that real with one man. Picture an American airman shot down over the Reich, sitting in a German prison camp on the standard ration. Potatoes, blackbur, thin cabbage soup, a little sausage. It was not the Fritz Ritz. He was hungry. He was cold. He counted the days. But he was alive, and he would stay alive. And a part of the reason was a German farmman stacking hay in Nebraska, being paid 80 cents a day, and writing home that the food was good. The two ends of the bet joined across 6,000 m. Feed the enemy's son, and the enemy feeds yours. But here is where the story turns one last time, and it turns on a single brutal fact. The German camp stayed bearable only as long as Germany itself could function. And by late 1944, Germany could no longer function. Remember what was happening to the Reich by then. The same bombing campaign that was flattening the cities was tearing the railways to pieces. And a railway that can't move troops also can't move food. So the potatoes that had kept Allied prisoners alive simply stopped arriving at the camps because they could no longer be shipped anywhere at all. The rations collapsed. One American prisoner of war, a private first class named Eridan, described what breakfast became in those final months. A single slice of black bread and hot water for coffee, but no coffee. The good treatment didn't end because the Germans turned cruel. It ended because the Germans ran out. They could no longer feed their prisoners because they could no longer feed themselves. And that finally is the thing underneath everything. The floor below the floor. It was never on either side about kindness. It was about capacity. Germany treated its prisoners decently, exactly as long as it had the means to, and not one day longer. America treated its prisoners like kings because America's means were, for all practical purposes, bottomless. A country can only be as generous as it is rich. And in 1943, the United States was the richest thing the world had ever built. Which means those letters home were never really describing American kindness at all. Read them again in your mind with this in view. The meat, the white bread, the wages, the tractor in the yard, the light in every room. None of that was a story about good manners. It was a story about capacity. Every full plate a prisoner described was a single data point in the one measurement that decided the entire war. The gap between what America could produce and what Germany could. The letters were, without anyone intending it, the most intimate ledger of that gap ever written, kept in the handwriting of the losing side. And now you can understand the disbelief at home in its truest form. The German mother couldn't accept her son's letter because she was living inside the very deficit it was measuring. The bombed-out railway that was starving that American airman in his Stalag was the same wrecked system that had emptied her own pantry, that had turned her coffee into acorns, that had made her son's description of plenty red like a cruel fantasy. She and the letter were two readings of one instrument. She simply couldn't bear to see the number it was pointing to because the number said, "It's over. We have already lost. We lost not on any battlefield, but in the arithmetic of what each side could make." The war did end, of course. And when it ended, the longue distance argument carried in all those letters. The son insisting, the family refusing to believe, finally had to be settled. Not in writing, not through two sets of censors, face to face. The men who had mailed home the unbelievable letters were going to be sent back across the ocean to the ruined country they had been trying to describe to stand in front of the people who had read their words and decided they were lies. What happened when those two sides finally met, when the prisoners came home, and when the truth they'd been trying to send arrived in a form no one could dismiss, is the part of this story that still has the power to stop you cold. Because the proof, when it finally came, didn't travel from America to Germany in a letter. It came in a cardboard box, and it was addressed the other way. By 1946, it was over, and the prisoners were going home. They were loaded back onto ships and sent east across the same ocean, many by way of Britain and France, where they were put to work for months or years more rebuilding what the war had wrecked before they were finally released. And as they came home, they watched the journey of 1943 run backward in reverse and in ruins. 3 years earlier, they had stared out of Pullman windows at an America without a single scar. Now they came home to the thing they had been straining to describe in their letters. Except they were seeing it from inside it. The flattened cities were real. The hunger was real. The country they had tried to tell their families about, by contrast, was now confirmed by the rubble at their feet. And here is where the long argument inside all those letters, the son insisting, the family refusing, finally broke, not with a word, with a body. Because a great many of these men came home heavier than they had left. Read that again and let it land. In the middle of a continental famine, with Germans dividing a single loaf of bread among a family for a week, the soldiers came back from captivity having gained weight. The mother who had read her son's letters and decided they were lies, that the Americans must have forced him to write such things, now opened her door and found him standing there alive, filled out, healthy, in a country where no one was any of those things. There was nothing left to disbelieve. The proof was in his face and in the breadth of his shoulders. Everything he had written was true, and it had always been true. And the only thing that had ever stood between her and that truth was how unbearable it was to accept. But the deepest proof didn't arrive on a returning soldier. It arrived, as I told you it would, in a cardboard box, and it came from the other direction entirely. In the spring of 1946, packages began landing in Germany from the United States. They came from an outfit called CARE, and they were bought and paid for by ordinary Americans and sent to ordinary, starving Europeans, including, remarkably, to the families of the very nation America had just spent 4 years fighting. Inside a single box, corned beef, bacon, lard, sugar, coffee, chocolate, powdered milk. To a German family living on ration scraps, it was a fortune and food dropped on the doorstep by the enemy. And watch what the Germans did with it, because it is the whole story played one final time. A German army chaplain named Klaus Putter received one of these boxes after the war when, as he put it, hunger and desperation were his daily companions. In his first reaction, holding a box of food he desperately needed, sent to him for free by the people who had defeated him, was suspicion. What's the snag, he wondered. What do the Americans want to do to us now? He and the others around him debated for 3 days what to do with the box, unable to believe there wasn't a trick hidden inside it. 3 days while they were starving. And only at the end of it did Putter arrive at the conclusion that thousands of his countrymen were arriving at the same time. Americans, he decided, are different. They help people in need regardless of who and where they are. Do you hear the echo? It is the exact same disbelief, the exact same wall that had met the letters years before. A German simply could not credit at first sight that American abundance was real and that it came without a catch. The food in the camp had been impossible to believe. The box on the doorstep was impossible to believe. The thing that had been so hard to swallow was never really the quantity of food. It was the moral fact underneath it that a country could be this rich and still choose to feed the people who had tried to kill it. That was the part no propaganda had prepared anyone for, and the part no classroom had managed to teach. In the end, it was taught by a tin of corned beef. And once Germans started tasting that truth for themselves, the bonds that had formed quietly behind the barbed wire came back into the open. That Nebraska family, the Lutchens, who had grown close to their prisoner farmhands. They mailed food and clothing across the ocean to those same men, now free and hungry, in the wreckage of Germany, and eventually crossed the Atlantic to visit them in person. They were not unusual. All across the rural America that had once feared and resented these prisoners, former guards and farmers, and the men they'd guarded kept writing to each other for the rest of their lives. And then came the final turn. the one that says it most plainly of all. Thousands of these men, somewhere between 5 and 10,000 of them, went through all of it. The capture, the camps, the long road home to a broken country. And then made a choice. They came back. They immigrated to the United States. Many of them sponsored by the very families whose fields they had worked as prisoners. The men who had been shipped to America in chains, certain they were going to their deaths, returned of their own free will to spend their lives there. The enemy chose to become the country that had captured him. So the letters that no family believed turned out to be true in every line and more than true. They were the first draft of how a defeated people would come to see the nation that beat them, not as a conqueror, but as something stranger and harder to fully take in. Which leaves us with one last person to hear from. One of those young soldiers pulled off a battlefield, fed until he was ashamed, carried through an untouched country, sent home, and left to make sense of all of it for the rest of his long life. Decades later, an old man now, he was asked a simple question about the war and the country that had held him. And his answer, quiet, and not at all what you might expect from a former enemy, is the truest summary of this entire story that anyone has ever given. It is where we'll end. The old man lived in a quiet district near Bonn in what had once been West Germany. His name was Vera Goltz, the same Vera Goltz who, as a young soldier captured a few days after D-Day, had stood in line for a third helping of food on an Allied ship, because some part of him could not believe the meals would keep coming. His life had gone on the way lives do. He spent 2 years as a prisoner at Camp Patrick Henry in Virginia, where, by his own account, he had a good time. He worked in the kitchen, grew vegetables, learned to bowl, played football, listened to American radio, and made friends among the people guarding him. He was sent to Scotland in 1946 to rebuild roads and finally went home a free man in 1947. The English he had picked up in captivity helped him land a job with the German Foreign Service, and over the years it carried him to Madagascar, to Nigeria, to Togo. He never did make it back to the United States. And then an old man, near the anniversary of the invasion that had swept him up as a boy, Vanagoltz was asked to look back on it all. He did not talk about the food or the camps or the strange comfort of his years as a prisoner. He thought about the Americans who died on the 6th of June on the beaches to begin the campaign that ended with him in custody. And he asked a question that had clearly stayed with him for 70 years. Why, he wondered, did America give their young men for us? Sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole story compressed into a single sentence. A German soldier looking back across a lifetime did not remember America as the nation that defeated him. He remembered it as the nation that gave its sons to free his country from the regime that had sent him to war in the first place. The men who had stood in line for that third plate of food spent the rest of their lives knowing exactly who their captors had been. Now go all the way back to where we started, to the brown hills above Tunis in the spring of 1943, and the 21-year-old sergeant with his hands over his head, certain he was about to be shot. George Faust, the art student who had carried a sketchbook across North Africa and filled it with faces instead of battles. He was not shot. He was fed and shipped and carried through an untouched country. And somewhere along the way, he sat down and tried to put what he was seeing into letters home. We know this for a simple reason. The letters survived. So did his sketchbook and his diary and the drawings he made of a world he never expected to see. The paper outlived the Reich. The 1,000-year empire is gone, and what remains sitting in an archive is the handwriting of a young man trying to describe the enemy to his family and failing because the truth was too large for them to take in. He was not the only one. An older prisoner named George Kellerman, a 41-year-old farmer with a wife and a young son back home, left behind his own stack of letters preserved by the people who later cared enough to keep them. And a man named Hans Vea, who had grown up poor in a cold water flat in Germany and said his treatment in America had been excellent. Vea came back to the United States after all of it, became a physician, and lived out a long life in a small town on the coast of Maine. The enemy soldier became the country doctor. So, let me give you the answer to the question we started with as plainly as it can be put. What did German prisoners mail home from America that no family could believe? They mailed home the truth. That the enemy was not cruel and was not weak and was not on the edge of collapse, but was instead so vast and so rich that it could feed the men it was fighting better than they had ever been fed at home, and so sure of itself that it could afford to be kind to them. And the reason no family believed it is the same reason the war ended the way it did. To believe the letter was to accept that the contest was already over, decided not on any battlefield, but in the simple crushing arithmetic of what one country could make and the other could not. The families chose disbelief because the truth was unbearable, but it was the truth the entire time. It was always the truth, and it came home in the end in their son's own hands. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. It means a great deal. If it moved you or taught you something you hadn't known, please take a moment to like this video. It's a small thing, but it genuinely helps this kind of history reach the people who would care about it most. And if you'd like more stories like this one, consider subscribing and tapping the bell so the next one finds you. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Leave it in the comments. And if someone in your own family served in the Second World War, whether in Europe or the Pacific, I hope you'll tell us about them down below. These stories stay alive only as long as we keep telling them. Until next time.